For decades, African nations endured the weight of colonial rule. Land was seized, resources were drained, and entire populations were oppressed. When independence finally came, the world moved on, including the very powers that had benefited the most. Many believed that chapter was closed, a painful story left in the past. But today, a new movement is rising across the continent, louder, stronger, and more united than ever before. Recently, leaders from across Africa gathered in Algeria for the International Conference on Criminalizing Colonialism in Africa. And with one powerful voice, they made a historic demand: full colonial reparations from former colonial powers. This demand is not for symbolic apologies, it is for real restitution, financial compensation, land rights, debt cancellation, fair trade agreements, and structural justice. Some call it bold, others call it impossible. But one thing is undeniable: Africa is no longer asking politely, it is calling colonialism to account. In today's documentary, we break down how this movement came together, what specific reparations African nations are demanding, which countries are leading the call, how former colonial powers are reacting, and what this could mean for Africa's future if the movement succeeds. To understand why African leaders gathered in Algeria, we must first understand the pain that carried them there. Colonialism was not just another chapter in history books. It was a force that reshaped Africa's borders, its economies, its politics, and its destiny. And even today, the effects of that era still live in the structures, institutions, and struggles of almost every African nation. When European powers took control of Africa, they did not come to build or uplift. They came to extract. Gold, diamonds, oil, fertile land, minerals, anything of value was taken. Infrastructure like railways and ports were built, yes, but only in places that made extraction faster. African communities were pushed into harsh systems designed to enrich foreign empires, and entire societies were disrupted and displaced. But the deepest wound came after independence, because colonialism did not truly end when the flags came down and new national anthems rose. Its influence continued through economic dependency, unequal trade relationships, foreign-controlled companies, and political structures designed long before Africans had a voice. The colonial era ended on paper, but its shadow still shapes daily life across the continent, and that is why African leaders are now demanding not just recognition, but reparation. Even after independence, most African nations remain trapped inside economic systems designed by colonial powers. Cash crops replaced food security. Raw materials were exported at low prices, while finished products were imported back into Africa at high cost. The imbalance was built into the system, and it remained long after the colonial flags were lowered. Institutions like the World Bank and the IMF continued this pattern, pushing economic policies that often weakened African industries instead of strengthening them. In many ways, the countries that once ruled Africa never stopped benefiting from its resources. But the damage wasn't only economic, it was cultural, social, and psychological. Entire identities were disrupted. African languages were pushed aside in favor of European ones. Traditional leadership structures were dismantled and replaced with Western political models that did not always fit local realities. Generations were taught that their history was irrelevant and that anything African was inferior. This psychological wound, a loss of confidence, dignity, and cultural pride, is one of the deepest consequences of colonialism, and one the continent is still fighting to heal today. Today, African nations argue that the effects of colonialism are not history. They are still happening right now. You see it in unfair trade agreements, in foreign companies controlling African mines, and in the massive debts that swallow national budgets. Many African leaders insist these are not coincidences. They are leftovers of the colonial system, tools designed to keep the continent weak, divided, and dependent. This is why African countries say they cannot simply move on. The past is not dead. It is alive in the structures of today. And in Algeria, the call for reparations grew louder than ever, not out of revenge, but out of a demand for fairness, dignity, and the chance for Africa to finally grow on equal terms with the rest of the world. But the push for reparations is not new. African scholars, activists, and presidents have been raising this issue for decades. The problem was that every voice stood alone. One country protested here, one leader complained there, and the world ignored them. But something changed in recent years. African leaders have realized that a single nation can be dismissed, but an entire continent, united in one demand, cannot be silenced. When Africa speaks together, the world has no choice but to listen. Algeria became the center of this movement for one powerful reason. Few African nations suffered under colonial rule as deeply as Algeria did. The struggle for independence was long, painful, and devastating. Historians estimate that more than 1 million Algerians lost their lives during the fight against French occupation. Entire generations knew only resistance, hardship, and survival. At the conference in Algeria, this history was not forgotten. Algerian Foreign Minister Ahmed Attaf reminded the world that between 1954 and 1962, Algeria fought one of the most intense anti-colonial wars in modern history. Countless Algerians were killed, families were displaced, and communities endured systematic oppression as French forces tried to maintain control in North Africa. It is this past that gives Algeria a powerful moral voice today. The scars of colonialism are not just written in its history books. They are woven into its landscapes, its families, and its national identity. So when Algeria speaks about justice, the world listens. And when Algeria calls Africa to unite, African leaders feel compelled to respond. That is why, when Algeria proposed hosting a continental gathering focused entirely on colonial reparations, the response was overwhelming. Presidents, ministers, historians, and activists from across the continent arrived in Algiers with one mission: to build a united African front for justice. For the first time in modern history, African nations gathered not to discuss aid, not to negotiate loans, and not to seek foreign partnerships. They came together for something far more powerful: justice. They came to reclaim dignity, and they came to confront a global system that still allows former colonial powers to profit, while many African nations continue to face the consequences of that era. The meeting in Algeria was not just another conference. It was a turning point, a moment when Africa stopped asking softly and began speaking boldly. A moment when African leaders realized that when they stand united, the whole world pays attention. But the key question is, what exactly did they demand? According to Algeria's foreign minister, colonial restitution must not be viewed as charity or goodwill. It must be seen as a legal obligation. Restitution is neither a gift nor a favor, he said. Africa has the right to demand official and explicit recognition of the injustices committed during the colonial period. Injustices that still shape economic exclusion, political marginalization, and long-term underdevelopment today. In other words, Africa is not asking for sympathy, it is demanding accountability. Now, one of the things African leaders demanded was acknowledgement. For decades, former colonial powers have avoided admitting the full scale of what happened: the forced labor, the stolen resources, the cultural destruction, and the mass killings. But African leaders are now saying, you cannot build reconciliation on silence. In simple terms, Africa wants Europe to officially recognize colonialism as a crime against humanity. And this is why, during the conference, leaders advanced a proposal made by the AU back in February, which is a unified African position on reparations and formally established colonialism as a crime against humanity under international law. While slavery, torture, and apartheid are explicitly outlawed by global conventions, colonialism itself remains undefined in key legal instruments, including the United Nations Charter. Think about that. The United Nations have refused to classify colonialism as a crime, and the reason is clear. If colonialism is classified as a crime against humanity, it means the colonial powers can be prosecuted under international law. But colonialism has not been classified because the governments that formed the United Nations were once colonial powers. Of course, they would not want to be prosecuted or forced to pay reparations. Can you see the hypocrisy of the international justice system? This is why the African Union is now urging the continent to speak with one voice, to formally declare colonialism a crime and demand reparations from the nations that benefited from it. And at the center of this call is a powerful shift. Africa no longer wants apologies, symbolic gestures, or selective aid. It wants a global legal standard that recognizes colonialism for what it truly was: an injustice that reshaped the lives and futures of millions. As Algeria's foreign minister emphasized, reparations must be a legal obligation, not a favor. Too often, when Africa raises this issue, former colonial powers treat it as charity, something optional, something generous, something Africa should be grateful for. But African leaders are rejecting that mindset. They are not asking for aid. They are demanding repayment. Economists have shown that colonialism extracted trillions of dollars worth of wealth from the continent in today's terms, through stolen minerals, exported crops, forced taxation systems, exploited labor, and the loss of entire generations of skilled people. Africa's argument is simple and direct. The prosperity of many European nations did not appear out of nowhere. It was built using African land, African resources, and African labor. So, reparations are not a gift. They are a correction of history, a demand for fairness in a world finally ready to confront the truth. Another major element of the reparations movement is the demand for the return of stolen cultural artifacts. For more than a century, thousands of sacred objects, royal treasures, and cultural symbols have sat in European museums, far from the communities that created them. Some were taken during military campaigns. Others were seized under the excuse of civilizing Africa. Today, African leaders are saying something simple and powerful. These items must come home. Cultural identity is not meant to be locked behind glass in foreign capitals. It belongs with the people whose history it carries. But the demands go even deeper. African nations are calling for an end to modern neo-colonial systems, policies and structures that still allow former colonial powers to influence African currencies, economies, and political decisions. Leaders argue that without dismantling these systems, reparations would be meaningless. True freedom must include economic independence. This united front has shocked many European governments. For the first time, Africa is not negotiating country by country. It is negotiating as a bloc of 1.4 billion people, rich in minerals, energy, culture, and one of the world's largest youth populations. And the movement is spreading. The Guardian recently revealed that the Caribbean community, CARICOM, is intensifying its own campaign for reparative justice, preparing to press the UK for formal apologies and financial redress. Caribbean leaders say centuries of exploitation created generational disadvantages that must be addressed. As Algeria's foreign minister noted, the global movement for recognition, restitution, and justice is no longer a fringe idea. Africa is stepping forward to lead. But the real question now is this: how has Europe responded to Africa's demands? Europe did not see this coming. For years, African nations protested individually, and Europe dismissed those protests as isolated frustrations. But when Africa gathered in Algeria, united, organized, and speaking with one voice, the mood inside European capitals shifted instantly. What had once been brushed aside suddenly became impossible to ignore. Diplomats who once felt confident began to feel something else: quiet panic. Why? Because Europe expected symbolic gestures, maybe apologies, maybe cultural dialogues. They did not expect Africa to demand financial reparations large enough to reshape entire economies, or legal frameworks that could rewrite the rules of international justice. Behind closed doors, European officials admitted their biggest fear: if they open the door to reparations for Africa, the rest of the colonized world will follow. Caribbean nations, Pacific islands, South Asian communities, all of them could make similar demands. It would trigger a global chain reaction that Europe is neither politically nor economically prepared to handle. Africa's unity didn't just amplify its voice, it forced Europe to confront a history it has spent decades avoiding. Second, Europe is dealing with internal division. Some nations, like Belgium and Germany, have begun acknowledging their colonial pasts and opening the door to discussions about restitution. They know the historical evidence is overwhelming, and silence is no longer an option. But other major colonial powers, especially France and the United Kingdom, are resisting fiercely. Their fear isn't only about money, it is deeply political. Accepting reparations would mean formally acknowledging wrongdoing they still avoid discussing in their own countries. It would mean reopening chapters they have tried to keep closed. For these governments, reparations challenge not just their budgets, but their national identity. Third, Europe is terrified of losing Africa. Today, Africa is one of the world's biggest sources of critical minerals, energy, and future markets. Meanwhile, countries like China, Russia, Turkey, and the Gulf states have strengthened their presence on the continent. Europe knows that if it refuses to confront colonial history honestly, Africa may shift entirely toward these new partners. And that would mean losing influence in one of the most important regions of the 21st century. In other words, Africa's united demand for reparations is not just a moral challenge, it is a geopolitical one. Europe now realizes that the cost of ignoring Africa could be far greater than the cost of facing its past. Some European analysts are already warning their governments that this new African unity is unlike anything they have ever seen. It is disciplined, it is strategic, and it is powered by a rising generation of young Africans demanding justice, transparency, and dignity. Publicly, European leaders are choosing soft, diplomatic words like dialogue, cooperation, and acknowledgement. But privately, they are worried. They know that if Africa remains united, Europe will eventually be forced to negotiate, not as a teacher, not as a benefactor, but as an equal, finally facing the consequences of its past. What is happening now is not just another summit or political gathering. This is the first time in modern history that African nations are standing together, not to beg, not to complain individually, but to demand justice as one powerful continental voice. And that alone makes this moment historic. For too long, colonial powers used a simple strategy to avoid accountability: divide the continent. They negotiated country by country, knowing that smaller nations had limited leverage. But that strategy cannot work anymore. Africa has now formed a single legal and political bloc, and when one African nation speaks, the entire continent speaks with it. This new unity gives Africa something it has never truly had before: leverage. But what makes this movement even more powerful is that it is not driven by governments alone. It is fueled by ordinary Africans, lawyers, researchers, historians, activists, and young leaders who have spent years gathering evidence of what colonialism actually did. They arrived in Algeria with documents, economic reports, testimonies, and data connecting Europe's colonial extraction to Africa's present-day challenges. They transformed emotion into strategy and pain into policy. For the first time, Africa's moral argument is backed by organized research, legal frameworks, and undeniable facts. African leaders also understand something crucial. Reparations are not only about correcting the past, they are about transforming the future. Imagine what Africa could achieve if it received even a fraction of the wealth taken from its lands. That money could fund industries, build modern hospitals, expand research centers, strengthen schools, and create technology hubs across the continent. Reparations could accelerate Africa's development by decades. This movement isn't just about what was lost, it's about what Africa could finally become. So what happens next? African nations plan to create a permanent continental body that will handle all reparation claims. This will stop former colonial powers from negotiating separately with weaker states. The goal is simple: no more divide and rule, no more manipulation. Africa will now speak with one voice on one table. Additionally, legal teams are preparing cases for international courts. Others are drafting economic claims. Some countries are even exploring cultural reparations, the return of stolen artifacts still displayed in European museums. And this is only the beginning. One thing is clear: Africa is no longer waiting for Europe to do the right thing. Africa is taking action, setting deadlines, and demanding answers. And the world is watching closely, because if Africa wins this fight, it will inspire other regions like the Caribbean, Latin America, South Asia to demand justice too. Europe knows this, and that is why this moment matters. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel.